Welcome to Policy Exchange. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gabriel Millard. I'm head of press here. Just in the manner of these things, I feel I should start with the admittance that I used to be a tabloid journalist. It's been an astonishing fortnight, really, and I think many people are right in saying that the relationship between politics and the press in this country will never be the same again. Neither will the relationship between politics, press and the people possibly be the same. We've got quite a lot we want to discuss here. First off, what's the future of press regulation? We have an absolutely stellar panel here. I'll just introduce the guys. David Wooding here, someone who has had a newspaper career of over 30 years. I looked at his LinkedIn profile this morning and I counted 6 national tabloid newspapers that he worked for, plus the Press Association. His most recent post was as Associate Editor Politics of the News of the World, and he's one of the 200 people who lost their job almost a fortnight ago now. George Eustace MP is a former press secretary to David Cameron, and I think, George, you won't mind me saying that you are one of the most high-profile proponents of regulation, really, of reform of regulation. Mike Granite is a former head of the Government Information and Communication Service. He's press secretary to 5 cabinet ministers, and also Sir Peter Imbert when he was commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. Joanne Cash is a freedom of speech campaigner and one of this country's leading media barristers as well. One of my great joys of my journalistic career was that I never had to spend much time with media barristers, but particularly when they're defending, they do an excellent job. And lastly, Heather Brooke, probably known to all of you, is also a freedom of speech campaigner and author. I don't think I'm overstating things to say that no American implant has had such an effect on the British Constitution since Wallis Simpson was here in the 1930s. But her indefatigable campaigning abilities was the thing that broke open the expenses scandal over many years. Her constant freedom of information requests, etc., resulted in the change in the law and a huge change in Britain's political culture and the collapse of many political careers as well. So we're going to talk about what the future is of press regulation. And we're going to talk as well, because I think it's linked to it, is there a future as well for a popular and commercial press, especially at a time, often technology doesn't really get mentioned much, but it's changing things so much at the moment. Newspapers are 19th century technology, and whether they in fact have much of a future. Also as well, I want to broaden things out a little bit as well and talk about how we can improve media standards, not just through regulation, but through things like better access to information, reform of the libel laws, which I think is very important, and lastly, churnalism has become a bit of a buzzword over the last few years, and whether it's become a byword really for poor quality journalism, and whether the effect of all this, of a neutered press in some ways, or a less economically viable press, will lead to more so-called churnalism, or just rehashing of stuff that everyone already knows. So here's the panel. I'm going to ask Dave just to kick things off with just a brief account of the last couple of weeks, what it's been like for people involved in this, and also where he thinks things are going and what some of the dangers are as well. David Wooding.
Good afternoon. What's happened in the last couple of weeks has been effectively our expenses moment for journalists. We've been on the receiving end of a firestorm for once, and it gave us an impression of what it must have been like for MPs who were caught up in the expenses row. Many of them were innocent, didn't do anything wrong, and if I can correct Gabriel's figure, I think about 286 people have been thrown out of jobs as a result. I think there were about 3 journalists who were in the news of the world when the hacking was going on, which, let's not forget, was 5 to 10 years ago. And I'd also like to spare a thought also for the many people who are not journalists who've lost their jobs, because among the toll are people such as secretaries, messenger boys, many of them working in the East End of London, near Wapping, who probably find it difficult to get a job. I was talking to a guy actually who used to sign the accounts off, and didn't really know him very well, and he'd been there for years, and we were having a beer in the pub after the closure. He revealed that he was just a messenger boy at the News of the World, poor boy from East London, got a job as a messenger, worked his way up, got a slightly more admin role, and then ended up sitting on the news desk of the biggest selling newspaper in the world, and he said, well, I'm finished now, I'm not going to get a job around here again, I've worked my way up within the News of the World structure, I haven't got a reputation outside here. And that's sort of lots of tragic stories in there, but the most tragic story of all is that people, the real victims, are those who were hacked. You know, we've got to hold our hands up and say that what happened at the News of the World was totally and utterly wrong. It was heinous, we're all ashamed of it. I was saying to some colleagues last night that I felt physically sick after Willie Dowler. I woke up on the Wednesday morning, this was the day before the closure was announced, and felt sick in the pit of my stomach. And I actually said to my wife after the shower that I felt quite unclean, even though I've done nothing wrong, because such was the depth of disenchantment with what had happened and disgust. So, but we are where we are, and we now have to clean up our act. Look, it hasn't been going on for 5 years, so really shutting down the News of the World was a reaction to the tarnishing of that great brand. Advertisers were pulling out, and it was Millie Dowler, in fact, which turned it into a big story. Before then, it was a few showbiz celebrities who'd been hacked, and we didn't know. We were quite shocked when the Millie Dowler story came out, that ordinary people were being hacked, and there appears to have been some kind of group of people who were using this Glenn Mulcair. The full story will come out eventually, whatever it is, whether they asked him to hack or whether he hacked as part of the inquiries they set him on. So where do we go from here? I agree with what probably some of the panelists are going to say, that journalism is going to have to take a long, hard look at itself, and we're going to face some tough regulations. But I just want to make a little plea before I finish. We are all very heavily regulated here. We have the super injunctions at the moment, which is stopping a lot of work of tabloid media. We have libel laws, we have privacy laws now coming in through the back door, and we also have the PCC Code of Conduct. Now, I must say, a lot of people think PCC's got no teeth, but if you worked in tabloid journalism and you saw how many times great stories we had were killed off by the PCC, you'd understand what it's like. I have a little thing, it's like a little piece of paper, I should have brought it with me, and it folds out like that. It's probably about that long when it opens out. And it's on both sides, it's got all the rules, and constantly the news editor, we don't do so much in politics, but the news editor, the editor, is pulling this out. Can we do this, can't we do it? We got some great pictures of David Cameron on holiday, perfectly good pictures. We had to get his approval before we could run them. You know, we rang the number 10 and we showed these pictures to them. You can use that one, you can't use that one, you can use that. That wasn't the case years ago. We'd just take a picture of a public place, we'd use it. We often get calls from the PCC saying, you're on celebrity X's doorstep, he, she has requested that you go away, would you please? Yes, we go away. Somebody has requested you don't knock on their door to ask for a quote. Okay, we don't knock on their door. Somebody says they don't want this story going in about their private life or whatever it may be, we don't put it in. And something like 7 out of 10 of these stories now, which is great tabloid fodder, don't even get written, never mind, get killed after they've been written. We are absolutely scared and terrified of the PCC, and editors take it very, very seriously indeed. So don't think the PCC is some toothless regulator, because it is taken extremely seriously and does a lot. I mean, John Prescott, you may have remembered, was on Newsnight recently, and the PCC chairman was pointing out to him that a lot of stories that he had gone to the PCC with had resolved themselves before they didn't even get into print. He got a bit uncomfortable when that was mentioned to him. And my other point is, very quickly, on the regulation. This story about phone hacking was not uncovered by MPs. Some people, one or two MPs like to think it was their tireless campaigning which stood it on. It was not uncovered by the police, clearly, who botched the first inquiry. It was uncovered by a journalist on The Guardian and his newspaper, who kept banging away at this story when nobody was taking any notice. And it was the campaigning journalism which exposed the wrongdoings in my own paper. And all I say to you is that if you over-regulate us, it will stop newspapers investigating issues like my own newspaper, like wrongdoings among MPs and other public servants. And if you're not careful, you'll be throwing the baby out with the admittedly scummy bathwater.
Thanks very much.
Okay, well, thanks, Gabriel. I'm a supporter of regulation of the media and have been for some time. And you might think, why on earth would a Tory, someone who's on the right of the Tory party and who's instinctively against regulation, come to believe that we actually needed to increase regulation on the media? And I think what I would say is that the 4 years that I was doing the job that I did as head of press of the Conservative Party and press secretary David Campbell, just day in, day out, trying to deal with stories that are untrue, that are sometimes written when they know they're untrue, that are hugely exaggerated, you just become very, very sceptical of the whole thing. And I think it's important to note that the PCC, which Dave referred to, it's actually not a self-regulatory body, it's a complaints process. People can write and complain. It doesn't actually properly try to regulate them. And I just think it's not sustainable that we have a situation at the moment, frankly, where Private Eye's Street of Shame column is the closest thing we get to holding our journalism to account. In my view, the nub of this debate and what's gone wrong surrounds the public interest defence that journalists use. Because if you look at the code, and Dave mentioned it, I've got a copy of the code here. You can see it, it's very simple, but there's a whole load of things there. They must be incredibly accurate. Respect privacy, harassment's not allowed, children mustn't be photographed or interviewed, clandestine devices should not be used, intercepting private and mobile telephone calls is not allowed. It's all there, except all of these key things have got an asterisk by them, and the asterisk says, except when it's in the public interest. And I think that frankly we've all got sloppy about arbitrating over what is and what isn't in the public interest. This public interest defence has been frankly used and abused over the years. We've ended up in a position where public interest is not, as we should understand it, it's in the interests of society that this information should come out, but instead it's morphed into something that's interesting for the public to read. And they're two very different things. And one of the problems with the code is when it describes public interest, it has a number of things. It says, for instance, there is a public interest in freedom of expression itself. Now, we might say that's true, but it's a very self-defeating thing to put in your code. It's effectively saying that all of these things can be ignored. You know, the right to print trumps all of these other rights. There's another thing where it says in Part 4, the PCC will also consider the extent to which material is likely to become in the public domain. Now that's the type of approach which leads press officers, and you have this, to have journalists coming to you saying, deal with us and we'll do the story sympathetically, even though they shouldn't be doing it at all. We had the row between The Sun and Gordon Brown over that story. For what it's worth, I can say this, that actually quite often newspapers will, it's the one area I think where they actually do pull their punches. When it's children and when it's medical issues, they actually will respect that. And I actually think The Sun were right on that. Gordon Brown agreed to cooperate with him when he shouldn't. But I think, you know, at the moment, we've all been sloppy about what the public interest is. The press have pushed the boundaries far too far. The police got sloppy about it. We're having all these inquiries now where everyone's saying, oh my God, look, why didn't anyone notice this Information Commissioner's report in 2006? How did they miss all of this evidence of phone hacking? You know, the truth is that the police, I think if truth be known, sort of shrugged their shoulders and said, well, you know, it's the media, that's what they do, and it's all in the public interest, and we have to live with this. And now they're being castigated for that. I think it's the same with politicians. We all had access to these reports. We all saw what the Information Commissioner had said, which highlighted 900 instances of illegally buying data by the Daily Mail and a similar number by the Daily Mirror. All of them were at it. Nothing was done about it because politicians too had accepted that this was the way things were done. And there's been a kind of boys will be boys sort of acceptance and tolerance of the way that the public interest test has been stretched, which I think we've got to deal with, because that's got us in this current position. I also think that the failure to have clear regulation has also led to the current mess that we're in with super injunctions, because what's happened is politicians have ducked the challenge, the police have shrugged their shoulders. There have been private prosecutions on privacy issues brought before the courts, and the courts have looked and said, well, this is clearly not right, so we are going to make public policy by coming down a particular way in a judgment. Now, that's a very unsatisfactory state of affairs. No one hates the Human Rights Act more than me. I would abolish it tomorrow. But we've got into this position because the courts have felt compelled to step into an area that, frankly, politicians and the media themselves should have sorted out a long time ago. I know some people say that regulation would lead to the taming of the media and muzzling the media. I think that's wrong. If you look at some of the best investigative journalism we have in this country, programs like Panorama or Dispatches, these are broadcast programs which are already regulated by statute in the Broadcasting Act and have a very tough broadcasting code which even puts a duty of impartiality on them. So I do not accept that it would muzzle our media. Say what you like about Jeremy Paxman, but he doesn't pull his punches in interviews, and nor do any of our broadcast media. As a press secretary, I find myself having to moan and complain about all of them at least once a week. So I don't accept that it leads to a tamer media. I also challenge this idea that it means ending free speech. No one, apart from Lord Kinnock, and I think everyone can accept that that's completely wrong, no one is suggesting that there should be a duty of impartiality on the newspapers. Melanie Phillips will still be able to write her rant in the Daily Mail. Polly Toynbee and George Monbiot will still be able to do all their stuff in the Guardian. It's not going to affect opinion at all. But what it might do if you had regulation is create a clearer distinction between news reporting, which should be accurate, if not impartial, but accurate, and opinion and comment and conjecture. Now, the code itself says that they should always already differentiate between those two, but frankly, they don't very often, in my view. And I would just say this, to people who talk about free speech, I used to have journalists sometimes apologise to me for the fact that they've been asked to write a story in a particular way or do a hatchet job, and quite often, and this happened regularly, if a political party briefs a story or makes an announcement with, say, the Daily Mail, you would find that the Sun would be up in arms about it and jump up and down, and quite often write what we would call a hatchet job story, which could be heavily exaggerated, maybe with a grain of truth in there somewhere, but heavily exaggerated, and effectively turn you over, almost as a punishment, if you like, for the fact you didn't give the announcement to them. The Daily Mail used to do this as well. You used to have this all the time. Alistair Campbell once talked about the Mirror and the Sun as being a bit like having two mistresses, that you couldn't keep them happy, and if you gave an announcement to one, the other one would be screaming and would do a story against him. We have to ask, is that kind of conduct actually good for free speech? Is that kind of conduct actually in the public interest, that people end up reading stories that are frankly untrue just because the editor's angry that an announcement was given to a rival paper? I think that's wrong. And journalists don't like that either, which comes to my very final point. If we had proper regulation, I think it would protect the professionalism of journalism. It would protect their integrity. If you had a system where there were proper sanctions for breaches of this code, and where an independent person was the arbitrator about whether or not something was in the public interest, you would create a whole knock-on series of events where journalists would be able to say to their editor, you know what, I'm not going to write that because that's not true. We're going to do things differently. And their editor would be less inclined to force them to write something or tell them to write a story in a particular way that they knew to be untrue, because there would be proper sanctions for them in failing to do that. So, in summary, I would say journalists should not fear regulation. It's not tamed our broadcast media at all, but it would, I believe, raise the integrity of their own profession.
It only proves I can't read my own writing. I think I want to confess my sins before speaking on this subject. I must have dealt with the news of the world hundreds of times in my professional career. I I have written to the News of the World, albeit briefly, on the subject nothing to do with this. I've had that Patsy Chatham's editor of the News of the World in my office at the Met. We did some good and quite proper business. And if any of you carry a UK press card, I chair the little pan-industry committee that supervises it. So my fingers are very dirty in this whole subject. I apologise. I also worked for Michael Martin, who you might remember, Speaker of the House, who had a few troubles of his own. So I think I've been through enough of some of these files that you just heard about as well. I am really worried about where we are in terms of this debate. I think we're in the middle of a frenzy of self-righteous indignation, and it's a lousy place to start constructing statutory bodies. I want to mangle Gladstone a little and say that I think that freedom of the press is trusting journalism tempered by prudence, and that it's the question of what comprises prudence and what comprises trust that should concern us. I also think we have to worry about reality. Policemen and journalists will not stop talking to each other. MPs and journalists will not stop talking to each other. The day I see somebody report a conversation in a register that's happening in the members' lobby of the House of Commons, I shall know we're on the slippery slope somewhere nasty. We have to take reality into account here. We cannot stop the business of normal human discourse because we're very cross about what's happened now. We have to look at the future very carefully. I don't think there's any regulatory system that should exercise control over every conversation and encounter in that way, because the only way to do it would actually be to reinvent starty for ourselves. So what are the issues for me? Well, the issues are about how do we rebuild trust and how do we apply prudence. In respect to journalism, of course, there must be people who do not have too much power. Whatever we've indexed, we have to make sure that the law, the institutions of the state, media owners, any major vested interests with power, including the rich, don't have too much power. And we have to ensure there's enough diversity in media ownership to dilute power properly. And we have to make sure that there is enough power among people who need it. Obviously, private individuals who feel they've been traduced, they must have recourse to doing something about it. And I think whatever regulator succeeds the PCC, however good the PCC was, political reality is it's dead in the water. Something has to replace the PCC as an ethical regulator. The question is, what nature is it? Whatever it is, it has to be transparent, accountable, and beholden to nobody in the way that it does its work. It's got to be operationally independent of its funders and sponsors. So even if it's set up by statute, and even if the newspaper industry and everybody else pays for it, it should not be beholden to those particular levels of authority. And I make my point again, it has to be open because otherwise it will end up like the PCC. It will die because of its very low profile. PCC code is indeed very strong. It was, I think, was it not, Dave, actually a part of use International's contract employment? Yeah, everybody signed up to it. I'm not sure the freelancers that Use International employed on contracts were shift here and shift there signed up to it. But I won't get it yet.
And Express newspapers aren't signed up to it.
Okay. But the fact is, they did sign up to it, and what good did it do anybody in that respect? I also think it has to be able to declare what it thinks the public interest is very loudly and robustly. I had a discussion with somebody just before we started about the case of the footballer who was selling sunglasses on the strength of his being a family man who was in fact screwing around. And shouldn't he be exposed? Well, bluntly, so what? I mean, just because a footballer is selling sunglasses doesn't turn him into a figure of authority in the state. I think the public interest has to do with those who demand public trust, exercise public authority. And whatever this ethical regulator does, it has to stand up and be counted on that issue very clearly, so people out there, journalists and everybody else, know what the issue is really about, what the judgment is about. Regulation of broadcasters is often cited as a reason why regulation would work for the press. I think that's entirely misfounded. The whole basis of regulation for broadcasters was based on the fact that radio frequency spectrum is limited. You are in fact handing over a monopoly. That is not a justification for regulating the rest of the media. And in fact, given the vehicles that the internet employs, with their virtually limitless capacity for channels, there's a very strong argument of going nowhere near that at all. Of course, if you have organisations as big as Sky, as big as the BBC, you probably do want to think about regulation because of their reach and their authority in some shape or form. But it's still some form of regulation independent a political vested interest. And who's a journalist now? Tell me who is not a journalist now. So you put your hand up, sir. Of course you are. We all are. If you happen to own a mobile telephone, you are potentially a citizen journalist. They pour out of underground stations in their thousands when there's been a bang or even a minor hold-up in that respect. So who are we going to regulate? At what point does a blog become a journal? And somebody's got to answer that question. If you regulate one part of the distribution of news, how do you not regulate other parts? So there's got to be some equity in this. Who is a journalist? Somebody who carries a UK press card, who basically has to be a professional journalist, who earns most of their money from journalism. Somebody who carries a Demotics press card, who may only do it at the weekends. Somebody who covers the local fete and hands copy to the local paper. Who is a journalist here? Before we start defining regulation, we have to define who we think we're going to regulate. And this may be something that goes too far. So I think that's something that, whatever happens in the future, when Parliament talks about these things, it better be very careful. It is easy to be populist and simplistic and meaningless, and the debate on regulation about the press must not get into that area. So, I'll end by boring you too much. I think standards of behaviour and craft in journalism have to come from a strong consensus of robust professional journalism, tempered by the demands and tolerance of wider society, and underpinned and reassured by an independent, open, brave, accountable, ethical, and God help us, I don't think, statutory regulator. Thank you.
Well, some of what I want to talk about, I wrote in more depth in a piece in The Guardian last Friday, and it was about the difference that I discovered when I came from, I'm a dual citizen, British and American, but I trained as a journalist in America, and then I came over here in '97, and wasn't really working as I wasn't working as a daily journalist, and not really any kind of a journalist, but I did try and find out some of the types of things I would have been able to find out as a member of the public, actually, in America. Things like criminal incident reports, getting court records easily, court documentation, finding out about how the police worked. I had some problems where I lived, and I wanted to know how many 999 calls there were, and of those, how many did the police respond to in time. Stuff about local council spending in detail, so what we call line item budgets, where every single itemized cost of a public authority is made public in the budget. All these things were off limits to the public in Britain, and in fact most of those things I've mentioned actually are still off limits. You could get court documents, but it's very difficult. That was why I really started doing freedom of information campaigning, because I couldn't believe that Britain was really so feudal. I found it to be an incredibly paternalistic culture based on patronage. And the way people got information wasn't through, there was no equality in access to information. It was entirely about patronage and privilege. So if I was a certain type of person, if I'd gone to school with certain people, if I knew certain people, I would have been able to get that information. But as a woman in the street, I couldn't. And I definitely feel that is exactly the same way this country is operating at the moment. It is a system of patronage around information. And what you end up then is you have information becoming a cartel industry. It's used as leverage. So as a reporter, I like to get my information with no strings attached. I don't want to have to take people out to lunch. I don't want to have to owe them. I don't want to have to write my story in a certain way in order to stay on their interview list. But that's how it works in Britain. That is how journalism works. It works somewhat like that in American federal reporting, but certainly in the sort of lower end, it definitely didn't. And that is why I campaigned for freedom of information, because it's about equality of access. It's basically saying you should not have to go to a certain school, you should not have to go to lunch with people, you should not have to be a major media player, you shouldn't have to live in the same neighborhood in order to get access that any citizen should have a right to get. And some of these things that I'm talking about, in Britain, they seem to be quite controversial. Even when the land registry records first went public, there was a great outcry saying, isn't it terrible, the common proles are going to know how much properties the transactions are, how much homes are when they're bought and sold. But these are actually the machinery of government. All these things, these pieces of civic information, civic data, things like land registry records, criminal incident reports, arrest logs, court documentation, line item budgets, they are really the building blocks of civic democracy. And they're the building blocks of good journalism. And the point is that you cannot get those civic building blocks to do that kind of good journalism without incredible effort. You have to make a lot of effort to get that here. So when I think the real crisis that we see is not so much about like a sudden. The issue with the press is more about the way we have, as a society around the world, completely devalued journalism and what it is, and we've come to look at it as just a widget on an automated line, and journalism as a business like any other business. And in fact, it's not. It's incredibly important to the health of all democracies, because it's the main regulator that can never be captured, because it's meant to encompass the whole general public. So this is why I'm against regulation, because what you find with regulation generally is inevitably there'll be a move to capture that regulatory system. Some people might be surprised, but I'm totally against the IPSA, the IPSA, that regulates MPs' expenses. It was never what I envisioned when I did the campaign. I wanted the people to know exactly what their politicians were getting paid and the allowances. I didn't believe in this added bureaucracy, because there already was a bureaucracy. But in the whole sort of furor, the very reactionary environment, similar environment that we have now, the first reaction of politicians is not so much how can we solve the problem, but how can we be seen to be solving the problem. And that is what IPSA was. It was how can we be seen very quickly to solve this problem. Let's start another bureaucracy. Because obviously, we all know how great bureaucrats are and how much they effectively solve problems. So regulation is definitely not the issue. The issue is about making it more cost effective, putting fewer barriers in the way of those journalists who want to do good journalism, and not having to expend so much energy in order to get information. The way it is at the moment, News International can access information from the police that most journalists can't access. Criminal records, for example, or addresses of people, telephone numbers. They're paying a heavy price to be able to access that material. And if they're doing that, I guess if you're looking at it from a totally commercial perspective, which seems to be what they're doing, you only want to expend that resource if you're going to be able to guarantee a good story and a good audience. Well, what stories guarantee those things? Stories about sex, celebrity, or scandal. And so that is generally, I think, why we have a British press which is predominantly about those topics. If you want a more academic or thoughtful type of journalism, then the barrier has to come down on equality of access to that information. So all journalism really does depend on some basic things. You do need telephone numbers, you have to talk to people. You do need addresses, you need to know where people live. You need to know about criminal incident reports. Why is it that we give the police this completely privileged access to knowing what crimes happen? I used to be a crime reporter in America, and one of my jobs was to go into police stations and look through every single police incident report. And then I would decide which ones were the ones that I thought should be in the paper. We leave all that to the police to decide what is in the public interest. And we see a lot of times how they use that for their own reputational advantage, or to hide instances where there could be reputational damage. So I have lots more to say about it, but I certainly don't think we need any more laws. I know from just another sort of cross-cultural comparison, when I studied journalism in America, all the media law classes were all about the laws that granted you access, the First Amendment, open records laws, open meetings laws. If you take any media law class in Britain, it's entirely, and I would say almost 90%, about what you cannot do. All the laws that prevent you from having free expression. I mean, it is heavy. Britain can no way call itself a freedom of expression haven. And if we're going to then add another layer of regulation on it, and it's completely impractical anyway. I mean, it's to completely ignore the fact that we live in an internet age where information flows across a global jurisdiction. So it's just completely impractical. It is a complete PR exercise. It's to look as if we're doing something when in fact we're not solving any of the problems at all.
Hi everyone. Thank you very much to Heather, who has done the most amazing amount of work on all our behalves to open up access to information in this country. And she brings us to what really is the nub of this, and it's left to the lawyer to say it, but hard cases make bad law. We often hear that expression, but we've seen the furore that has surrounded hacking, the inquiries that are going to ensue, the time and the expense that's going to be involved in that, and we worry that there may be imminently new regulation to restrain good journalism. And there are some of the best journalists in the world in the UK. And let's not forget the amazing stories that have been uncovered by investigative journalism. Some of them using subterfuge and illegal methods. The World Cup votes for sale on the recent bid for the World Cup football. Didn't know I knew about football, but there you go. Cash for questions. MPs' expenses, of course, using stolen CDs. Thalidomide, using subterfuge. An incredible story of massive public importance, but which used properly illegal methods to obtain some of the information. Traffic Europe, which those of you who are free speech campaigners like myself know was a terrible cover-up by a corporation responsible for the deaths of innocent people by dumping toxic chemicals off the coast of another third world country. Watergate, even Watergate, an American, the famous American news scoop used some illicit methods in dealing with some of the witnesses. They even approached members of the grand jury to get comments and information from them. I think one of the journalists in the last 2 weeks, while commenting on what we refer to as Hackgate on Twitter, said that he probably regrets that, but if the public were asked if they regret him doing it, I bet they would have a different answer. An ultimate vindication, of course, when Nixon fell. So even the news of the world, look at the stories that were uncovered by Sheikh Mohammed. Drug stings, the dirty bomb, when he almost, pretended to be able to sell red mercury and brought the police in to arrest terrorists. 78, something like 78 arrests followed from his investigations. I mean, not all of them were arguably in the public interest, and some of them were clearly sexual in nature. But do we regret that he exposed Fergie, exposing the royal family to international shame and ridicule? No. Is it a massively public interest-based story? No. But, we have to ask ourselves here, what kind of press do we want? And I think what Heather is highlighting also is what kind of country do we want to live in? It's very easy to look at a discrete number of corrupt police officers, a number of very, very corrupt journalists, some corrupt private investigators, and to mash it all together, leaving to one side, of course, the very serious questions about the relationship between politicians and the media. But to mash all those issues together and using the conduct of a number of discrete and specific individuals to tar everyone with the same brush. As some of you know, I'm a bit of a Twitter addict. And this morning, it was trending again, of course, the story, because the police have requested the Freedom of Information Commissioner's report from 5 years ago. Well, the report is 5 years old, and of course it's now a story because the police have requested to see it. But there was a lot of anger on Twitter, a lot of excitement that many other newspapers, other than the News of the World, were listed as having hundreds, in some cases, of transactions with private investigators to obtain information. Now, there's an assumption there that what they were doing was illegal, but that's not necessarily the case, because the dealing in this information does often lead to important stories. We have to wait and see, but prejudging these things and reacting from our guts is a mistake. And it worries me enormously at the moment that there is this feeling of we must tie down our press, we must tie them down, we must stop this from ever happening again. Well, the two issues aren't there. What has actually happened is so far one newspaper and a number of people on that newspaper at least 5 years ago are responsible for some pretty grotesque behaviour. But so far, no one else is in the frame, and yet here we are at Policy Exchange, one of our most esteemed think tanks, discussing a possible consequential increased regulation of the media entirely. That must be wrong, and it cannot be a rational and proportionate reaction to this entire scandal. In the same way as Heather, as only someone with dual citizenship could say, because certainly someone British, and particularly someone who had stood for Parliament, couldn't criticise the fact that the new regulatory system has been brought in for MPs. But it is arguable, isn't it, whether it was a proportionate response to the behaviour of specific individuals. And so let's try to bring back some scepticism here, some rationale, and some proper intelligent debate around what it is necessary to do. As you heard, I practiced as a media barrister for all of my career at the bar. And I can tell you that there are far too many laws already governing our press. For 5 years now, I have been campaigning to reform the libel laws, which have led to us being criticised by the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which says that our libel laws are a clear restriction and limitation on free speech. We have become a laughing stock internationally as alleged terrorists come here to sue over tiny publications in this jurisdiction, which would be laughed out of court anywhere else. Am I the turkey voting for Christmas? Yes, perfectly happy to do so, because I do what is right in this. I don't want my daughter to grow up in a place where people cannot debate issues about public figures and to criticise issues of serious concern, because the laws have become too restrictive and the cost of enforcing them or fighting them in the newspapers' cases has driven them out of business. That's the libel laws. Then look at privacy. Since the introduction by the Labour government of the Human Rights Act and Article 8, the right to a private and family life, we've seen a massive encroachment and limitation on what the press can write about. The only thing I disagree with David about is the PCC, which I'll come on to. But what he did talk to you about is the fact that they now stop and think, can we use this photograph? Can we talk about this aspect of someone's life? Can we talk about that? Everything comes, people are now using, celebrities and public figures are using privacy laws to stop articles they wouldn't previously have been able to stop using the libel laws. Because although it's not defamatory per se to talk about private aspects of their life, it is an invasion, arguably, of their private life. And we know that the courts and the judges, the High Court in London, have been very amenable to the use of this particular article. And despite the specific requirement within the Act to balance it with Article 10 for free speech, Article 8 seems to be making clear headway as the front runner in that particular race. Yet again, the press are restricted and held back. We have data protection requirements, which of course are the subject of the Information Commissioner's report. There are layers and layers of legislation, layers of regulation already in existence Do you think because we have theft laws and murder laws and rape laws that people won't murder and steal and rape? No, it's not an absence of regulation that is the issue here. It's the misbehaviour, the criminal behaviour we shall probably see in the end, of a number of specific individuals and a culture of one particular paper. Now, if this spreads wider, if we end up talking about the press as a whole, then we are talking about a more widely spread cultural issue. That brings me on to the question of the PCC. You saw me hold up the document that Dave was talking about. It's this. This is the PCC Code of Practice. Now, it's not a long piece of paper. It's quite wide, it's double-spaced. There are a number of points, 16 in total. They deal with accuracy, opportunity to reply, children, for example, hospitals, not intruding into hospital, but for example, 16 in total to deal with. It's not tricky. But the problem with this, and the problem with the institution set up to enforce it, the PCC, is that it never had any teeth. There's no consequence to breaching the code. Absolutely zero. And as a libel lawyer, who was, as you can tell, never mad keen on litigation, and I always felt, and still do, that if you can avoid going to court, you should, and it's in your client's interest to keep that level of stress out of their life. But I was never able to say, look, why don't we forget about the libel case, which is going to, risk your home, risk your family, risk the costs, and just make a PCC complaint and get a really good apology. I couldn't say that, because the apology would be on page 45, one paragraph in size. There would be no payment to a charity, no gesture of conciliation, no gesture of remorse. In addition to which, there is no revocation of license to be a journalist, which is impossible. I've seen in recent days that people have talked about, well, of course they must regulate themselves because doctors do and lawyers do and so on. Yes, we do. Professionals do in most cases because they can have permission to practice revoked, ultimately, or they can be suspended. That is not a sanction that has been possible. So I find myself in this crazy situation where, having for years spent time howling from the desert, crying, for God's sake, someone make the PCC do its job, or are we going to end up with more laws and more regulation and the press is going to be less free? Finally, it seems that people have realised it. But what worries me is it's the people who want regulation who are now saying, let's give the PCC the powers, and at the same time, let's make sure there's really proper regulation here and really tight and really strict, and make sure that maybe we even enforce it like we do with the broadcasters. So we ended up in a situation, the media has ended up in a bizarre situation that by failure to regulate itself, it created more and more hostility and has allowed this idea to take currency that there should be greater regulation, that regulation is somehow the answer to this. My own personal view is that regulation is rarely the answer to anything, and bureaucracy is rarely the answer to anything. But leaving that to one side, I don't believe that regulating a healthy press in a healthy democracy is ever the answer or will ever lead to anything really good. So what does happen now? Well, something that was slightly lost in the middle of Hackgate was the interesting story of Johan Hari, the independent journalist. He has his own website and has for years written from the left wing, obviously commentating. And very serious articles have been published on the internet about the fact that he has spent a long number of years criticising and destroying the reputation of other journalists. These are all allegations at the moment, and as a libel lawyer I should make it absolutely clear to you that I have no proof that any of it is true, but those are the allegations that have been made about him, and those in consequence of which he has been suspended pending an inquiry from the Independent, and his website has been taken down. The Wikipedia entries about the people who have had additions put on, bizarrely by the same named person, in consequence of things they've said or done about Johan Hari, remain there to be seen. But what I felt was really interesting was that the power of Twitter and the power of the internet meant that one journalist responding to Hari's own admission that he had made up quotes in interviews, and a number of people republishing that information have led to the self-regulation, if you like, of the industry. And arguably, if it's proven to be correct, the weeding out of someone who has been malign and dishonest about other members of his profession, which is in no one's interest. And it made me think that actually we've been right about the libel reform, because it's not just that our laws are draconian, it's not just that they're restricted, but it's that the times have changed. The internet is going to provide its own means of regulation. The public will be able to adjudicate on these things. The public will be able, and journalists obviously, will be able to put these things right by force of popular opinion. Take the withdrawal of the journalist Paul Lambert, who got his press pass withdrawn in Westminster as a result of, I mean, it was bestowed anyway, but as a result of reporting the breach of security. Within hours, the Twitter campaign, which launched on the back of that in uproar, had ensured that his press pass was reinstated. So I suppose my conclusion to all of this is that not only do we not need further regulation, we need to be vigilant about the freedoms that we have and fight harder to loosen the hold on the press, which is already commercially fighting for its life given the competition around. And we should look to the current and future development of the internet to regulate the press, as it is beginning to do in a very, very effective way. I think I could just conclude by saying to Heather that, again, thank you for the work that she has done to help us to free up what is really an odious feudal system, and to see that we want to have more information available to us and more readily available. And I just want to conclude on the police, because I found it quite shocking, and I'm sure some of you did too, when Sir Paul Stevenson, in his evidence, admitted that the Metropolitan Police had 48 press officers. I think 63 in total if you count the part-timers. And you know, with all the arguments about cuts and so on, I thought to myself, what have they got 48 press officers for? And of course, Heather has brought the point up beautifully again, that it's to decide what you and I should know. You know, why should they be the arbiters of what Prime Ministers, and I laugh at that, and I appreciate obviously that there's sometimes information which needs to be secured, but leaving those arguments to one side, which incidentally are also regulated and have plenty of laws governing them. Shouldn't it be the case that we could, like an American citizen, avail ourselves of the Institute reports locally? Shouldn't we be able to access what's being spent at local government level, which incidentally Westminster Council is now doing? But you know, these are important issues for us, and I hope that if nothing else, after today's debate, you will at least go away more reluctant to punish all of the press and all journalists for what has happened. Thank you.
I want to thank the panel for 5 terrific contributions from Dave from one of the best working journalists I know on what it's like to be caught up in the eye of the storm, and from the perspective of somebody working at the sharp end of newspaper journalism. I thought George gave a particularly persuasive depiction of some of the dysfunctionality of the relationship between the press and politics that's grown up over the last 10 years, and I think Mike's point that we're a lousy place to start, but there is a better way of doing things, and starting to come to grips with the kind of thing that a regulator might seek to influence is also extremely interesting. And of course, Heather, as kind of First Amendment almost view of what we need to know, and Joanne's very persuasive depiction and quite enthralling depiction of the ways the internet and public pressure and the market itself can act as a regulator as well. We've got time for questions, and so I'd like to kick the ball off with some contributions from the floor. If you could say who you are and where you're from, that would be great. And I think we've got some floor mics as well, if that would be helpful. So who'd like to go first? Gentleman over there.
Thanks. I thought I should stand up first because I'm Will Gore from the Press Complaints Commission. I think it is clear that there is a very long debate to be had about the future of press regulation in the UK. At this current time, the PCC is not dead in the water as far as people who are complaining to us are concerned. It's not dead in the water as far as charities are concerned who work with us to improve standards of reporting. It's not dead in the water as far as journalists are concerned when they come to us for training and so on. And I think there is no doubt that what has happened in these laws is absolutely appalling, and it does raise questions about press regulation going forward. But I do think that it is important to bear in mind, and I think we've got a flavour of that from the speakers, that the PCC does do an awful lot of good work, and of course, you can question whether it ought to have a wider mandate and so on. That's a slightly different question, but it does work effectively for people who use it. It works effectively in terms of the training we provide. It is effective in terms of evolving, for example, to establish indices, notices, and help people who are at the centre of a media storm. The code evolves over time. The membership of the Commission evolves over time, and I worry that in this debate there is a view that we should simply get rid of it all and start again, and I think that would be a very serious mistake, while recognising absolutely the need for reform in a number of areas. For example, resourcing of the PCC. The fact is it is a tiny organisation being asked to do an awful lot. So there are things that we have to recognise. I just wanted to make really a point about comparisons with other regulatory structures elsewhere around the world, because I think occasionally you hear people saying, well, of course this wouldn't happen in other countries, but actually the system in the UK of having, of course, a number of laws that relate to the press and a self-regulatory press council is very, very similar to certainly most European countries and other countries around the world. The ways in which it is perhaps different is that the PCC is more independent in the sense that it has a board which consists in the majority of public members. That is not true for local press councils. And it carries out more sort of mediation work, which again is not done by a lot of other press councils. So I think actually the system we have has a lot of good to it, albeit that clearly reforms will be made in due course.
Thanks very much. Does any of the panel want to come back on that?
I'd just say, actually I think there was quite a bit of consensus about where it was said I was coming from different areas, and actually there's not much wrong with the PCC code itself. But I come back and say the issues in the enforcement of it. And I think if we could have a code that was actually properly enforced and independently enforced, with somebody crucially deciding what is in the public interest, because that's where it's all gone horribly wrong. The loss of that thing. And I think it would, it would be. So we're not actually, I don't think, looking at a major departure from where we are now, but a significant improvement in terms of how we look.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the case was made about, let's not forget, it's all about hacking. This is all about hacking. It is illegal to hack. So the law didn't stop that. I think as Joe was making the point on that. And how do we stop hacking in the future? If a reporter was to come up now, let's make the point, it would be absolutely crazy to hack a phone now. If a reporter was to hack a phone and then listen in and say, Sienna Miller's got a new boyfriend, and then go to the news editor and say, I've just had a tip that Sienna Miller's got a new boyfriend, and they go around to the house to get a picture of her walking out with a new boyfriend, and that is being obtained by hacking a phone. How is the news editor to know? How is Rebecca Brooks or whoever's in charge of the company to know at that stage? The answer is it can be done. It's a law can be broken. In the same way, if the editor says to his secretary, pop out and buy me a cheese sandwich for lunch, here's £5, and she goes and steals it off Tesco's shelf, and then keeps the £5 and has been doing that for weeks, the editor's not going to know. So you can regulate to hell if you like, but there's always going to be people who will break the rules.
So.
Yes. Hi, I'm Tom Podrowski. I'm currently the Director of Market Reform at Ofcom, the water regulator, so you might wonder what the hell am I doing here? But in a previous life, I actually worked for nearly 6 years at Ofcom. And when I was at Ofcom, I drew up the code self-regulatory code for the organisation for senior management to determine when it might be appropriate to use self, co, or statutory regulation, because Ofcom has a duty under the Comms Act to promote self-regulation, believe it or not. And I had to look at a range of schemes. I had to look at self-regulatory schemes and co-regulatory schemes in telecoms and broadcasting. And I looked at the PCC, and I have to say this was back in about 2007, 2008, long before any of these scandals hit. And I have to say I was pretty underwhelmed by the code itself. Now, of course, if I had published that in my consultation, all hell would have broken loose, because I would have been accused that Ofcom was trying to park its tanks on the lawn of the PCC, and that we were trying to somehow open up the debate on press regulation. So that was dropped, but the principles nevertheless sort of remain, and there is a statement on Ofcom's website. And the whole idea is, when you're considering the design of a self-regulatory scheme, and I don't think we necessarily need to lose that, you need to carefully think about the incentives that the industry will have to comply with any code, what the enforcement mechanisms are, and is it sufficiently resourced? And I think there needs to be a careful examination of that, because whether we abolish the PCC and replace it with something else, there clearly needs to be a reform, and I think an incentive-based mechanism is the way to start to examine it. Thanks very much.
Give that man a new job, I think.
I think it's a good point, actually. I mean, one of the thoughts that I had in terms of brass tacks of how you might make the regulatory environment work is you could even have a sort of independent regulator that insists, for instance, there's got to be proper sanctions in the system, but that insists if the code's been breached, an apology of an equivalent size, equivalent provenance must be given. So if, worst case scenario, a paper decides to splash a story that's willfully done and they know it's not true, well, maybe occasionally they would have to give over a front page apology, or maybe even just a page apology somewhere else in the paper. But there are things you can do there to make the sanction real, and if you did that, papers would think twice before splashing a ropey story. They might still run it, but they might put it on page 10 rather than page 1, for instance, and that would be, I think, a healthy thing. I think the other thing you could do is have a kind of appeals process where you maybe did involve Ofcom, so that if the independent regulator looked at it and dismissed it, then there would be perhaps, in some circumstances, some kind of appeal process so somebody else could take a look at it. I think, and at that point have even tougher sanctions. I mean, the truth is that Ofcom can put on a fine of £250,000 to a broadcaster that breaches their code, and that focuses minds. Now, I'm not sure, I mean, the difficulty, I think, is you're right, Ofcom looked, the last government looked at whether the press should be brought under Ofcom. But I think Ofcom itself didn't really want to do it. It's a bit like the teacher that doesn't want to take on the unruly class of kids who are, not going to be easy to control. And there is a cultural difference between our newspapers and broadcasting, which I respect.
David Henke.
David Henke, ex-Guardian, now freelance journalist. I actually wanted to take really quite a lot of issue with George Eustace about wanting a statutory sort of system, because I don't think, I mean, you've got a lot of sides about having a lot of trouble with Cameron and complaints, but I'm looking at it on the other side as a journalist trying to investigate. And my suspicion will be it will be used by people who actually have got high public profile, fairly wealthy, as a further curb on what journalists can do. And I'm not just saying this, I'm going to give you some good examples of stuff I've done in the past to show this happens. When I did the Cash for Questions investigation, they weren't so worried, well, they were worried we were pursuing it. So first of all, one of the MPs went to the editor to get me taken off the case without realising the editor had authorised it. Failing that, they then went to try and change parliamentary privilege so they could pursue things. But then on top of that, they then pursued a sort of policy of finding other excuses. Now, I normally do corruption rather than sex. So, the main lobbyist involved, Ian Greer, decided that actually there was nothing to do with the corruption in this thing. I was pursuing because he was gay. And I was trying to get my career, and he argued this quite strongly. I thought, well, this is extraordinary. I really want to pursue my career so far against gays that I've joined this gay-hating newspaper called The Guardian, which destroy them. But the thing is, these people are prepared to go along different lines. And Hamilton as well initially wanted to bring criminal libel proceedings, which hadn't been used for years. But then he ran into the problem that his lawyers said, well, excuse me, David Henke actually took you out to lunch a couple of times. Could you explain why he's got a malicious thing just to pick you up? Similarly, I had a go at a trade union leader who was, frankly, his expenses were appalling. But he was stupid enough to take a member of staff to a tribunal, and as a result, all his expenses came out in the tribunal hearing. It was Roger Lyons, actually, at the time. He, when he complained, didn't say it was wrong, because he couldn't. What he said was that and this was a fact, that 20 years previously I happened to have bought his house, and the house he thought he might have conned me over it. He hadn't, and therefore this was my revenge. Now, and the final one I might add, which I thought took a new length from the way lawyers go. Now, I am pursuing, and still pursuing, a dodgy lobbyist that I won't say who, but as a result of this, I decided to put a load of questions to him. And the law firm came back saying you could be committing libel by just asking this. Fortunately, the Guardian had lawyers who threw this out, but it shows you what they're prepared to do. And I also questioned him on, as Heather has said, the land register was available. He was a company director, so he could get the address quite easily. And I was rather puzzled that somehow he had paid £1 million cash for a house when he only had a turnover in his company of £500,000 a year. And his lawyers came back and said, no, this is a breach of his privacy. You've got no business to look at this. Again, nonsense. But what worries me with the statutory body, that some people are going to start using this as a way to stop legitimate journalism. And they will do this, because I've been quite amazed at what lengths people are prepared to do this. So all I would say, we might have a crisis at the moment, an argument about happening. But if we go and impose regulations on this one, particularly at a time when Heather's dream is beginning to come true, and I will praise Cameron, and I think Francis Moore has every reason to be terrified, the opening up of all this information of what's, public contracts and everything else is making it much easier to find much more out. And we don't want to shackle the press just at the point when a lot more information, which will enable and break down that privilege you were talking about that does exist, and allow much more people access. So all I would say is, we must get real and not actually fall into this trap.
Well, I probably want to just to briefly say, I don't think any of the things you said would necessarily be affected by a code that was enforced. As I said, not Sloan but often said, I don't see much wrong with the PCC code. I do think there needs to be some independent adjudication. And it's where, your point about they would say, well, it's a breach of privacy. They might, but then the public interest test would be assessed by somebody who would be a neutral person to do that, and who would say, actually, you know what, it is not in the public interest that you pursue this particular individual. Or, if it's a politician, we're usually fair game, they would probably say it is in the public interest for you to pursue. So I don't see it getting in the way. Keep up the good work.
Excuse me, sir.
Ray Lucas, House of Lords. The Advertising Standards Authority Code begins with the concepts of truth and honesty, and not misleading. And it seems to me that if we had that in the newspaper code, we would see enormous improvements. Even the Guardian sins occasionally, printing a picture, for instance, of a factory streaming black smoke, which is actually steam with the sun behind it. The Telegraph, all through the parliamentary expenses scandal, was untruthful and dishonest in the way that it presented individual MPs who were really not guilty of anything much. And today, for instance, we have Lords claiming more on expenses despite reforms. In other words, there's an average increase of less than 1% where the membership of the Lords has changed by 20%. It is not an honest way of dealing with information. And it seems to me that if we attacked that through the code, if we required newspapers to be, by their own lights at least, truthful and honest and not to mislead, we would get great improvements. To pick up on what Mike Grammett said on regulation in an internet age, if you look at what Hargreaves is proposing on intellectual property, in an internet age, and the way he's talking about controlling that, he has some very interesting mechanisms there of schemes that you join, and if you join, you get privileges. In the case of newspapers, perhaps some protection from libel law, so that you can create a structure that people want to join because it's worthwhile for them, and it gives them a badge of honesty that other people value. And last of all, let us for goodness sake avoid repeating IPSA.
Well, I would say I agree about the truth and accuracy, honesty, and about the ethics of journalism. But the point I was making is that we have the power to broadcast these things ourselves, to publish them. And failing that, of course, is PCC is here, so we could raise the question of the expenses, the Lord's expenses, as an accuracy issue. But there is, enough people talking about something on the internet, on Twitter, on Facebook, on their own blogs, does bring a level of shame and a level of moderation to the original pieces now.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's the point. I think you have to realise that calumny could be created on the internet just as much as you can in newspapers, and that we have to be fairly wary that you can run a campaign on the internet which is completely false-based, and that will happen. When it happens, it will be interesting to see what the recourse will be. So I think you're right about the Hargreaves proposals, and I think actually Hargreaves' proposal, the principle, could be applied to a regulator of the press, make it worth people's while to comply. Particularly
not to do a Desmond and completely pull out of the BCC and say, I'm just not having anything to do with this anymore.
No, what I mean is, much of this is about the trust of the reader in the newspaper. As I have to use the word's commercial. It wasn't a viable paper anymore because basically it had been wiped out by public opinion and commercial reality. What Hargreaves is proposing is essentially something that says, here is something that will give you more trust and privilege among your readers and among the environment that you want to do. I think a press regulator should look at that as the incentive to be part of the system which is voluntary and open and very, very obvious to the reader that says we comply, rather than simply relying on sanctions, although sanctions have always got to be there. But how do you sanction a small local paper? Well, I'll tell you how you sanction it, because I started on a small local paper. Your mistakes meet you in the street, and they'll tell you what a prank you are.
Can we just bring a bit of honesty to the discussion today, actually, which is something no one has said, but the unpalatable truth is that these other stories, the News of the World type stories, sell. It wasn't the best-selling newspaper for no reason, and the public want to read this stuff, and I read it. We all. Hands up who's guilty of buying one of those headlines to see what's going on. Oh God, it's ridiculous.
They're alive.
So let's bring some honesty back in here. But these stories do sell. People, we are voyeuristic by nature. We want to know what's going on in other people's lives. That's why there's such a phenomenal success in reality TV, and it's all very well people getting high and mighty and saying, oh, the good old days when we were all so proper and so good. We didn't have access. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have broadcasting facilities. And we have all of that. Times have changed. So we need to use those same tools to moderate ourselves. I'm not saying, by the way, that the internet and a democratic internet process can replace the PCC. I am not saying that. But I do think the PCC needs to have some bite if it's going to be heeded by the press. And I do think that when they receive a complaint later today about misrepresentation of the Lord's expenses, that they will take that very seriously. I'll help draft the letter.
Dave first.
I'll tell you how many people in this room buy the News World, nearly half of them, because the statistics show that 4 out of 10 papers sold on a Sunday was a News of the World up until last weekend. 48% of those were women incidentally. And the figures that came out last weekend show that people probably didn't want the News of the World to go under permanently, because all the sales have transferred to the papers. I'm sure many of them were likely disappointed with the one they got in the other papers this weekend. However, just the point about truthfulness. Yes, we all try to be truthfulness, but again, how do we regulate that? There's the law of fair comment, or the defence of fair comment. You know, if I was describing this room here, one journalist could say it's got an impressive stucco ceiling. Somebody else could say it was shabby and faded and with peeling paint and in need of a refurb. You know, it just is a matter of opinion. What's truthful, what isn't? You know, and even just covering a court case, you've got to write your intro, and your intro could be somebody, an MP up on an expenses scandal. You could say, you could do your intro, if he pleads not guilty, MP yesterday denied he filled up his expenses. Or you could say, MP hauled before a judge yesterday accused of fiddling his expenses. One's got a slightly different edge to it. One makes him sound more guilty, the other one makes him sound perhaps a bit innocent. So I don't know how you regulate for truthfulness. I take your point, you're absolutely right. We do need to be truthful. And you've got, you know, the first thing you learn when you're a trainee journalist is fair, accurate, balanced reporting. And I think regulating too much might curb the style which people like to read in newspapers.
2 points. We haven't really talked about the fact that crimes were committed, and as such, why didn't the police investigate them and take any action? And they didn't. And the reason they didn't is because they were all in a cozy relationship with the people committing the crimes. And to me, that's where I know there's one inquiry about that, but this is the thing, you don't need to just create more laws when you're not dealing with the laws that you've already got on the books. And frankly, you know, I deal with the regulator all the time, the Information Commissioner, and I can tell you it's exactly the same story. You know, everybody's moaning about how ineffective it is, it's under-resourced, doesn't have any bite, there's no real sanction if people break the data protection law or the Freedom of Information Act. So I see exactly the same thing coming down the pipe. We have another press regulator. I would like to focus more on the laws that are on the books and actually taking action to ensure they're being heeded. Secondly, the whole idea about regulation, it's so paternalistic, because it's basically saying we don't trust the public to discern who's a liar and who's not, or you know, we think that we know better how to tell them what they should read and what they shouldn't read. But actually, what you do see on the internet is that it does become a self-regulating marketplace of ideas. And you can see that there are developing social norms where people, if somebody's done something...
you think of Jan Boyer and things like that? So
yeah, well, I mean, there's any number of cases on Twitter or on the internet where it does become self-regulating. Somebody will go beyond a social boundary that the rest of the people think should be there, and they might not even know they've breached it, but very quickly, by the reaction, the instant reaction now that there is. And what's amazing about the connectivity of the internet is that if people feel the same way, they instantly connect, and they become a pressure group, like an instant pressure group, which, you know, in traditional politics it takes a long time to gather a campaign like that. But on the internet, I mean, it is instant. Somebody does something instantly, a pressure group arises to challenge what's been said, what's been done. So in the privacy injunctions, somebody tweeted a load of them, super injunctions, who they were against. And not all of them were correct. And one of the ones that was incorrect was saying Jemima Khan had taken out a privacy injunction. She was on Twitter and she said, this is not true. And instantly her rebuttal went around Twitter, and then everybody, like within seconds, that had already been demolished. So the rumors sprung up and then it was demolished. So I do say leave it to the people, enough with the paternalistic regulating.
There was another very small example recently, I can't remember the name of the journalist, but there were 2 boys who killed on a gap year, and she tweeted something like, I couldn't help smiling when I heard they had double barrel. I heard they had a double barrel name, and she was absolutely slaughtered online. And there is that level of connectivity and discipline which is not available on, you know, even with broadcasting, unless you use Sky Interactive voting system, I suppose.
I just want to briefly say on the idea that people quite often say it's going to be impossible to regulate because of the internet and it's great. I'm not sure that's right. You know, we've regulated our broadcasters for
I know
years.
Britain is trying very hard to be the next
firewall. No, let me just. I think basically no. I'm just going to come on to that. The truth is that we've regulated our broadcast media, despite the fact that we've had a largely unregulated print media, and that's it's not been an impossible thing to do. They've been able to coexist. And I think one of the problems, the truth about both the newspapers and the main broadcasters, actually perform together collectively a platform for national debate and discussion in a way that actually, notwithstanding what enthusiasts of the internet say, it really isn't. The internet's very, very atomised. And when people talk about successful internet campaigns, they only actually really take off generally once they jump into the mainstream media, like the newspapers or their coverage.
You say it doesn't cut the mustard?
It doesn't, because it's very atomised. If something's on the BBC News or it's in the Sun, you know, 3-4 days in a row, you can drive 300 miles away and somewhere in a pub people will be talking about that issue. If someone starts some internet campaign, there'll be a few hundred people all talking to each other and slagging one another off, and that's as far as it goes. It's a very, very atomised thing. So I think the difference between the print media and the national media is they form a sort of platform for national discussion on big issues, and I think that's why it's right that we have a different.
Sorry, I'm just going to move on because we have quite a lot of people still on the line, and we just have only a very little amount of time. Gentlemen here.
Yeah, Keith Raff, I'm a former member of Bond and Fleet Street and TV presenter, so both sides. I just say to Heather Brooke, I mean, I'm no defender of the police, and I'm glad that Yates and Stevenson have gone. I don't think Stevenson should have ever been appointed in the first place. I think he should have been an outsider like Hugh Ward. But, you know, when it comes to their resources, having to investigate phone hacking and terrorism, I mean, I know which I would rather they put the resources in. It's just a point that I wish to make. I mean, I feel that, you know, a case of the Dangerous Dogs Act coming on, which deeply worries me, which is that, you know, the great virtue of royal commissions, which have now gone out of fashion, is that it used to take so long that by the time they actually produced the report, everybody forgot what they're actually looking into. So there's a certain calm response to their recommendations instead of the frenzy we have now. But I think what this is a symptom of a much wider crisis in the media. And there is a culture of pressure in newsrooms for scoops, etc., etc., you know, which is well known. We've got, actually, I think investigative journalism is on the decline. Sorry to say that to some of the people here, but it is. Since the highlight type, you know, of Insight in the Sunday Times under Harry Evans. When you look at the BBC, if people are worried now about the governance of News Corp, I'm worried about the governance of the BBC, and I'm glad that Lord Patton's intervening in the way that he did. One of the statistics that came out last week, and I'll end with this, which I think is very interesting, is that the audience of Newsnight has actually halved in the last 5 years. And I bumped into, this week, into David Sells, who is for 26 years, very old school, but very distinguished reporter on Newsnight. He says it's become far too studio-based, starved of resources, which are now going towards Mark Thompson's £876,000 salary and the £500,000 for Graham Norton. Let them go off somewhere else. They should be nurturing talent. They shouldn't be chasing ratings. We pay for them. They should be accountable to us. The only thing Patton's wrong about so far is we don't need bands of who's being paid what. We need to know which individual is being paid what. Because the BBC has lost its standards too, and it should be up there, and the others follow.
Thank you very much. Any more?
A couple more here.
Is
that all right?
We'll carry on. Yeah, carry on.
Okay. A quick question. It seems to me inevitable, Rod Dowell at the Industry Forum, it seems to me inevitable that individual reporters will always break rules and break the rules. The serious problem, however, seems to arise when they're backed by a very large, powerful media company that kind of obstructs investigation and any action on it. This kind of problem can only really be addressed by competition law and press ownership rules. And I wonder what the panel think about what should be done in that respect.
Well, pretty clear on that. Nobody should have the sort of power that Murdoch had, because it corrupts everybody around. Corrupted him, corrupted his papers, corrupted politicians, probably corrupted policemen. That amount of power in one man's hand. And, you know, that's a wonderful act the other day. And all I thought to myself was Ernest Saunders. People remember Ernest Saunders. It was a great act. I mean, everybody paid court to him. Everybody paid court. And paid court to his papers. That is not a position for elected officials to be in.
So how do you fix it?
Yes. You make sure the competition laws actually restrict ownership very strictly.
20%?
20% is still a huge chunk of the market. Something below 15. Something that says that you cannot determine the outcome of the election. It might be hard to do, but you know then live with the alternative.
What I find extraordinary actually about the relationship of politicians with the news world and News Corp is that the fact that they bought into the idea that they had that much power. I mean, they've never decided the outcome of an election. It's rubbish. You know, if you talk to any ordinary reader or any voter when you're canvassing on the doorstep, they don't care what Rupert Murdoch thinks or anyone else for that matter. They either care about how many bins are being cleaned every week, or they're watching Newsnight. I mean, there's nothing in between. They're not looking out the news of the world on Sunday to see what way they should vote.
But that ignores the effect that papers have on politicians.
I'm not denying, and that's missing the point I'm saying. I'm not denying that. What I said is I find it extraordinary that the relationship developed the way it did, that the politicians believed they had that kind of power. And I think it was much more about the politicians wanting the newspapers to convey their message than having the real belief in what was going on. But now there are so many other ways, and I do disagree very strongly with George about the way campaigns run. I mean, the libel reform campaign alone took off on the internet, led by Simon Singh and Westminster Skeptics and Index on Censorship. There were tens of thousands of us signed up. And the result is that legislation is in the process of being changed. And if you want to change things, that's where you go now to do it. We ended up being covered by the broadsheets and by the newspaper, but only long after that kind of number of people were already behind it and the politicians were already listening.
George,
I think briefly, I've been on the issue about politicians paying court for private. I mean, I agree with that, but I think that's already ended. We don't need to do anything, because I think after this incident, basically the culture will change. I think everyone realises.
Temporarily.
No, I think also there's a very important point that I actually think media ownership is less of an issue, because frankly they're all losing money. Their circulation's diminishing. They're all struggling. And actually, let's face facts. The thing that moves public opinion are the main evening broadcasts. ITV is far more powerful than Murdoch, just because of the audience it has and its moving pictures. And the BBC's got a huge market share. So I actually think that this thing about Murdoch having market share is exaggerated. I think it's true that politicians have had an exaggerated sense of his power. Exactly. But I think that's already ended.
We've got time for one final question. Sophie.
I'm Sophie Bridge, I work for Sky News, and I used to work for News of the World with David Wooding. My question, yesterday David Cameron announced who would be on the panel for this inquiry into the media. Several very worthy journalists with backgrounds from the Financial Times, the Daily Telegraph and broadcasters, but I did notice that there was nobody who had a background in tabloid journalism. And I just wondered if there was a risk that tabloid journalists are being frozen out of this debate.
Absolutely. The first thing I noticed, Sophie, glad to see your instincts haven't changed since you left the team. Yes, there is always, again, this is something we haven't covered today. You know, we're talking about the media being broadcast and print. There is a clear divide within the media, as David will agree, between the tabloids and the broadsheets. I mean, the tabloids tend to do more stuff that people want to read. Which is why Murdoch's papers are so successful, not because of the power of Rupert Murdoch, it's because he wrote about things, or the papers and his editors covered things such as immigration and taxes and things which they're worried about, education standards and all the key issues. So I think we need a tabloid man on there as well, because, you know, let's be honest, a huge chunk of the circulation of newspapers are tabloids. And you need somebody in there who knows what we want and how it will affect what we do on the tabloid paper. Otherwise, if you get a broadsheet one chap there who says, oh, we shouldn't write anything about sex or showbiz or rock and roll, then what the hell are you going to put in the paper?
I agree. I think we should put Dave on. And I think that there's a serious point here. There's a danger in this, and everybody gets pious and talks down tabloid journalism. And I actually think there's a value to tabloid journalism, because it does, papers like The Sun and the News of the World, they did actually, by and large, give over a page or more to politics. You had the Fraser-Nelson column in the News of the World. That actually used to make politics accessible to a large number of people who otherwise, wouldn't be following it at all. And I think it's very important that we don't neglect this way.
Just want to get one final question and contribution from Lady Benson.
Thank you very much. I'll probably make an enemy of half of you and then make a friend of the other half of you, because I'm now a lobbyist. But I was a political journalist with the BBC for 10 years. And I appreciate George's point there about us not getting snobbish about tabloid journalism, because it's an extremely important part of our fabric of freedom of speech, and it'd be a great shame to see it curbed. Anyway, that aside, I want to ask all the panel, briefly I know, because we're pushed of time, what you think will be the shape of the relationship between journalists and politicians over the next 5 to 10 years? I know there's some scepticism, it will just go back to normal, or do you think this really is a change where we have to see politicians all accounting for every meeting they have with journalists and the impact of that on freedom of speech? I got some of my best stories with politicians who were talking about issues that they genuinely didn't realise were issues. And I'd go away, look into them a bit more, come back to them and say, okay, this will make a story, why are you happy to go with this? So everybody's much on the know. I just wonder what everybody thought would happen in the long term.
Yeah, I don't think it'll change. In fact, there was a great example of how it won't change last night, because me and my team threw a little drinks party in the Commons to say goodbye and thank you, and it was swarming with MPs and ministers, and they all came in for a drink with us. Tom Watson wasn't there.
I'm the news was there.
I'm the news was there, and George was there. I mean, great example of Tom Watson. In fact, you know, his lunch bit, we lose a bit of weight because he's lunching out with Murdoch type of trophies, which is the past. But he, you know, even Tom would come out for a beer with us and go for lunch with us and brief us about things that were going on, you know. So this is going to go on. All these people who are getting a bit puffed up at the moment and say we're too close to the media, I don't think it's going to change a bit. I think at the end of the day, they'll want to tell us stories, they want to brief against their enemies and their opposition, and we want stories, and we're all living in that same little village over there, and we're neighbours. It's just like the local journalist in the local village. We've been popping into the pub to talk to parish councillors. We'll be still doing it over there.
I don't think people are ever going to stop talking to each other. I mean, I think it would be wrong to think that politicians that journalists should talk to anyone. They should have a free rein to talk whoever they want. Politicians, police, etc. What I'd like to see is that there's more emphasis put on ensuring that that journalists can get information with no strings attached. So not so much comes through favoritism or through favor, and that they can get more of it just as just a record, that they don't owe anything to anybody. They can just look it up, and they don't have to make any kind of a deal with that.
I don't think it'll change us, but I hope it'll change in one important way, and that is politicians. There's a key difference between meeting journalists, talking to journalists, briefing them regularly. That's important. We should go on. We shouldn't be sort of saying we shouldn't.